Welcome to the Before Bed channel, your place to unwind, relax, and drift into sleep with fascinating stories and unforgettable tales.
My name is Noah, and tonight I have a story for you called The Man Who Spent His Life Chasing Tomorrow. Before we begin, take a moment to slow down, let the world grow quiet, and make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and when you're ready, let the story begin. When Elias was a young man, he lived in a small house at the edge of a quiet town, where life was simple, but his dreams were enormous. Every morning, he watched people hurry toward their futures and wondered when his own life would finally begin. He believed happiness was waiting somewhere ahead, just beyond the next achievement, the next opportunity, and the next tomorrow. Elias had only one thing that he wanted more than anything else: a better life. He did not know exactly what that life would look like, but he was certain it was waiting for him somewhere in the future. One day, he often whispered to himself, "When I have enough money, enough success, and enough freedom, I will finally be happy." And with that promise, he began to run. He found his first job in a crowded office and worked longer hours than anyone around him. While others went home when the evening came, Elias stayed beneath the cold office lights, believing every extra hour was another step toward the life he wanted. Whenever exhaustion whispered that he should stop, he reminded himself that rest could wait, because there would always be time to live properly tomorrow. Years passed, and Elias slowly earned more money than he had ever imagined. He bought better clothes, moved into a larger apartment, and began eating at restaurants he once thought were meant for other people. Yet whenever he looked around at everything he had gained, a strange emptiness remained inside him. Instead of asking why, he simply smiled and told himself, "I'm almost there. Tomorrow will be different." One evening, an old friend invited Elias to leave the city for a few days and travel somewhere peaceful. But Elias refused because an important project was waiting on his desk. His friend asked when he would finally make time for himself, and Elias laughed softly before giving the answer he had given many times before. "Soon, when this is finished, I'll have all the time in the world." But the project was followed by another project, and the next opportunity appeared before Elias had even finished celebrating the previous one. His life became a long line of unfinished promises, each one pointing toward a future that seemed brighter than the present. He kept moving forward without realizing that every step he took toward tomorrow was quietly carrying him farther away from the life already happening around him. His mother often asked him to visit, saying that she missed the quiet conversations they used to have when he was young. Elias always promised that he would come when work became less demanding. "Next month," he would say, and his mother would smile and tell him not to worry. Neither of them knew how quickly time could turn a simple promise into something that could never be fulfilled. Then, one winter morning, Elias received a phone call that made the entire world around him suddenly feel silent. His mother was gone. He sat alone in his office, staring at the unfinished work on his desk, and for the first time in many years, he could not think about tomorrow. All he could remember was her voice asking him to come home, and his own voice promising that he would. That night, Elias returned to his apartment and looked at everything he had worked so hard to obtain. The expensive furniture, the beautiful view, the carefully arranged shelves, and the numbers in his bank account suddenly seemed strangely meaningless. He had spent years building a life he believed would make him happy, yet the person he most wanted to share it with was no longer there to see it. For the first time, Elias wondered whether he had misunderstood the meaning of tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow was never a destination waiting somewhere ahead, patiently holding the happiness he had been promised. Perhaps every tomorrow simply became another today the moment it arrived. And if that was true, Elias suddenly faced a frightening question. How many todays had he sacrificed while believing he was preparing for tomorrow? After his mother's funeral, Elias returned to work almost immediately, as if keeping himself busy could prevent the silence inside him from becoming too loud. His colleagues praised his dedication, and soon he was offered a promotion he had once dreamed about. Everyone congratulated him, but when Elias heard the news, he felt no excitement at all. For the first time, success had nothing to say to him. The promotion brought a larger office, a higher salary, and a new title printed beneath his name. Yet Elias discovered that none of these things could fill the empty chair across from him at dinner. He began eating alone more often, staring through the restaurant window at people laughing together on the streets. Somewhere along the way, he had gained everything he once wanted and lost the reason he wanted it. One afternoon, while walking through an old neighborhood, Elias noticed a small bakery where he and his mother had once shared warm bread on rainy mornings. He stood outside for several minutes, watching steam rise from the windows. He could almost hear her laughing beside him, but the memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Elias looked at his watch, sighed, and continued walking toward another meeting. As the years continued, Elias became known as a man who never stopped working. He rarely took vacations, rarely declined an opportunity, and almost never allowed himself an empty afternoon. Whenever someone asked why he worked so hard, he gave the same answer with a confident smile. "I'm building something for the future." Yet he never stopped to ask what kind of future he was actually building. Eventually, Elias bought the house he had always imagined, a beautiful place overlooking the mountains with wide windows and quiet rooms. He walked through it alone on the first evening, touching the polished wooden walls and admiring the view. This was supposed to be the moment he had been waiting for all his life. Yet when the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the house felt strangely empty. That night, Elias prepared an expensive dinner for himself and opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. He sat at the long dining table beneath a warm chandelier, surrounded by everything money could buy. Then he realized something painful. He had spent so many years waiting for the right moment that he had forgotten that moments were never waiting for him. Elias began looking through an old wooden box filled with photographs from his younger years. In one picture, he was laughing with friends beside a river. In another, his mother was holding a birthday cake. There were countless ordinary moments he had barely remembered, and suddenly each one seemed more valuable than everything surrounding him. He wondered how many beautiful moments he had called ordinary simply because they were free. The next morning, Elias woke before sunrise and sat quietly beside the window. For once, there was nowhere he needed to be, and nothing he needed to accomplish. The world outside was slowly turning gold. Birds were beginning to sing, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. It was a beautiful morning, but Elias felt strangely uncomfortable because he had forgotten how to simply be present. He decided that perhaps he needed one final achievement before he could truly stop. There was a company he wanted to build, a fortune he wanted to secure, and a reputation he wanted to leave behind. So Elias returned to his old habits with renewed determination. He convinced himself that this would be the last great pursuit, and after it was finished, he would finally allow himself to live. Years later, Elias achieved that final goal too. His name was known, his fortune was enormous, and his business had become more successful than he had ever imagined. Yet, on the evening of his greatest celebration, he stood alone on a balcony overlooking thousands of city lights. Everyone below was celebrating his success, while Elias quietly wondered why reaching the top felt so much like standing at the edge of an empty road. That night, Elias left the celebration before it ended and walked alone through the sleeping city. For the first time, he had no appointment waiting for him, no project demanding his attention, and no ambition pulling him toward another distant goal. The streets were almost empty, and the sound of his footsteps echoed between the buildings. Yet instead of feeling free, Elias felt as though he had finally caught tomorrow and discovered that there was nothing inside it. He stopped beneath an old street lamp and looked at his reflection in a dark shop window. The face staring back at him was older than he remembered, with tired eyes and silver beginning to appear in his hair. Elias suddenly realized that he had spent most of his life preparing to become someone else, while the person standing in front of him had been quietly waiting to be noticed. The following morning, Elias opened an old drawer and found a letter from his mother that he had never read. The envelope was worn from years of being moved from one place to another, yet her handwriting remained clear. He hesitated before opening it, afraid that the words inside might awaken memories he had spent years trying to outrun. The letter contained no advice about money, success, or the future. Instead, his mother had written about an ordinary afternoon when Elias was still a boy, remembering how they had sat beneath an old tree while rain fell softly around them. She wrote that she had never forgotten that afternoon because Elias had once told her that he wished time would stay there forever. Elias read the sentence again and again until his eyes filled with tears. He had spent decades believing that happiness was something he had not yet reached, yet his mother had remembered a moment when he had already possessed exactly what he was searching for. He had been happy once, not because he had enough, but because he had been completely present in a moment that asked nothing from him. That afternoon, Elias left his office without telling anyone where he was going. He drove beyond the city, past the fields and quiet villages, until he reached the old river where he had once spent his childhood summers. The place looked smaller than he remembered, but the sound of the water was exactly the same, as though time had moved everywhere except there. He sat beneath a tree beside the river until sunset, listening to the water and watching the sky change colors. Nothing extraordinary happened. No fortune appeared, no mysterious voice spoke, and no miracle changed his past. Yet Elias felt something inside him becoming quiet. For the first time, he was not asking what would happen tomorrow. He was simply watching what was happening now. When darkness finally covered the river, Elias noticed an elderly man sitting several meters away on the opposite side of the bank. The stranger wore an old gray coat and held a small silver pocket watch in his hand. He seemed completely unaffected by the cold evening air, watching Elias with a calm expression that felt strangely familiar, as if he had been expecting him for a very long time. The old man raised his pocket watch and asked Elias a question that sounded almost absurd. If you could have one more day from your past, which day would you choose? Elias stared at him, unable to understand why a stranger would ask such a thing. Then the old man smiled and added, "Be careful with your answer. Some people spend their whole lives wishing they could return to a moment they never noticed." Elias looked toward the dark river and thought of all the years he had spent chasing a future that never seemed to arrive. Then he remembered his mother beneath the old tree, the rain falling around them, and his younger self wishing that the moment would never end. He slowly turned toward the stranger and gave his answer. "I want the day I thought was too ordinary to remember." The old man listened without surprise, as though Elias had given the answer he was expecting all along. He slowly opened the silver pocket watch, but instead of numbers or ordinary clock hands, Elias saw a tiny image of the old tree beneath the rain. The stranger told him that time never truly disappeared. What disappeared was our ability to return to the moments we failed to appreciate. Elias asked whether the old man could truly return him to that day, and the stranger answered that he could, but only for a short while. He could not change what had happened, erase his mistakes, or bring anyone back from the dead. He could only give Elias one chance to experience a forgotten day exactly as it had been, and perhaps understand why he had spent so many years running from the present. The old man placed the pocket watch in Elias's hand and told him to close his eyes. The sound of the river seemed to disappear. The cold night air became warm, and for a moment Elias felt as though he were falling through an endless sky. Then he heard something he had not heard in decades. The soft laughter of his mother calling his name from beneath the old tree. When Elias opened his eyes, he was no longer an old man sitting beside the river. He was young again, standing beneath the familiar tree on a rainy afternoon, wearing the simple clothes he had forgotten. His mother sat nearby with a warm cup of tea, smiling at him as though nothing in the world could possibly be more important than the quiet afternoon they were sharing. For several seconds, Elias could not move. He simply stared at his mother, afraid that if he spoke, the entire moment would disappear. She noticed his strange expression and asked whether something was wrong. Elias shook his head and smiled through his tears. He wanted to tell her everything he had learned, but somehow he knew that this day was not meant for explanations. Instead, Elias sat beside her and accepted the cup of tea she offered. They talked about ordinary things, the rain, the garden, a neighbor's noisy dog, and what they might cook for dinner. Nothing about the conversation was extraordinary, yet Elias listened to every word as if it were the most precious story he had ever heard. His mother suddenly looked at him and asked what he wanted to become when he grew older. The younger Elias answered with the same ambitious dreams he remembered, speaking about money, success, and becoming someone important. His mother smiled gently and said that those things were not wrong, but she hoped he would never become so busy building a life that he forgot to actually live it. The words struck Elias with a force greater than anything he had experienced in his long career. He wanted to tell her that she had been right, that he had spent decades chasing a future that kept moving farther away, but his voice failed him. So he simply leaned against her shoulder, just as he had when he was a child, and listened to the rain falling through the leaves. As the afternoon slowly faded, Elias realized that this was the day he had spent his entire life searching for. Yet when it had first happened, he had not recognized its value at all. He had been too young to understand that ordinary days could become precious memories, and too distracted by tomorrow to notice that happiness had already been sitting beside him. The rain eventually stopped, and sunlight appeared between the clouds. Elias looked at his mother one last time and finally understood why he had chosen this day. He had not returned to change the past. He had returned to see what had been there all along. As the old tree became surrounded by golden light, Elias held his mother's hand and whispered the words he had waited decades to say, "Thank you." The moment Elias whispered those words, the world around him became strangely still. The birds stopped singing, the leaves stopped moving, and even the sunlight seemed to pause between the branches. His mother looked at him with a peaceful smile, as though she understood everything he could not explain. Then she gently squeezed his hand and said, "You were always looking so far ahead, my son, that you forgot to look beside you." Elias felt tears running down his face as he realized that those simple words contained everything he had spent decades trying to understand. His mother had never asked him to abandon his dreams or stop working toward a better life. She had only wanted him to notice that life was already happening while he was busy preparing for it. Then the golden light around them began to grow brighter. Elias held on to his mother's hand, afraid that letting go would mean losing her all over again. But she only smiled and told him that some people leave our lives without truly leaving us, because the moments we share with them become part of who we are. Elias closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and promised that this time he would carry the memory forward instead of trying to chase it backward. When Elias opened his eyes, the rain, the tree, and the afternoon were gone. He was standing beside the river again, old and gray, with the silver pocket watch resting quietly in his palm. The elderly stranger sat across from him exactly as before, but now Elias understood that the journey had never been about changing yesterday. It had been about finally seeing yesterday clearly. Elias looked at the stranger and asked why he had been given such a strange gift. The old man closed his pocket watch and answered that it was not a gift at all. It was a reminder. "People often believe they need more time," he said, "when what they truly need is to stop wasting the time they already have." Elias remained silent, letting the words settle inside him. The old man stood and walked toward the riverbank, his footsteps slow but steady. Elias followed him with his eyes until he suddenly realized something strange. The stranger's reflection was not visible in the water. Before Elias could ask another question, the man turned around, smiled, and said, "You have spent enough time chasing tomorrow. Perhaps now you should learn how to meet today." Elias blinked, and the old man was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no movement among the trees, and no trace that anyone had ever been standing there. Only the silver pocket watch remained in Elias's hand. He opened it slowly and discovered that the hands had stopped moving, pointing toward no particular hour. For the first time, Elias felt no need to know what time it was. He sat beside the river until the sky became completely dark, watching the stars appear one by one above the trees. His phone remained silent in his pocket. His unfinished work could wait, and the world had not collapsed simply because Elias was doing nothing. He smiled quietly at the thought. Perhaps doing nothing was not always wasting time. Sometimes it was finally allowing yourself to have it. The next morning, Elias returned to the city and entered his office carrying the same briefcase he had carried for years. His employees expected him to begin another demanding day, but instead he opened his calendar and quietly removed several unnecessary meetings. Then he called an old friend he had not spoken to in years and asked a simple question. "Are you free for lunch today?" His friend was silent for several seconds, almost unable to believe the invitation had come from Elias. They met at a small restaurant and talked for hours about everything they had missed. Elias listened more than he spoke, laughing at old memories and asking questions he should have asked years ago. When they finally said goodbye, he realized that nothing extraordinary had happened, yet the day felt richer than many of his greatest achievements. From that day onward, Elias began changing his life in ways that were almost invisible to everyone else. He still worked, still cared about his responsibilities, and still pursued meaningful goals, but he no longer treated the present as a waiting room for the future. When a friend invited him somewhere, he sometimes said yes. When the evening was beautiful, he stopped working long enough to notice it. He began visiting the old bakery near his childhood neighborhood, sometimes sitting by the window with a cup of tea and watching people pass outside. He no longer hurried through every moment. He noticed the smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain against the glass, and the warmth of sunlight across the wooden table. Ordinary things had not changed. Elias had simply learned how to see them. One evening, Elias returned to his large house and found himself standing before the empty dining table where he had once eaten alone after achieving his greatest success. Instead of feeling the old sadness, he walked into the kitchen, prepared a simple meal, and invited several neighbors to share it with him. The house suddenly sounded different when it was filled with ordinary voices and genuine laughter. During dinner, one of the guests asked Elias why he had suddenly become so generous with his time. Elias smiled and looked around the table before answering. "I spent a long time believing that life would begin after I finished everything I needed to do," he said. "Then I realized there will always be something left unfinished, and perhaps that is not a problem at all." The guests laughed, but Elias continued quietly, explaining that he had spent years treating every unfinished task as a reason to postpone happiness. He had believed that one day the list would become empty. His responsibilities would disappear, and he would finally have permission to enjoy his life. Now he understood that the list would never end, but his days eventually would. After dinner, Elias stepped outside and looked toward the mountains. The night was clear, and thousands of stars filled the sky. He remembered how he once measured his life by promotions, possessions, and numbers, as though a larger number could somehow make his existence more meaningful. Now he measured it differently, by conversations remembered, hands held, sunsets witnessed, and moments in which he had truly been there. Years passed, and Elias grew older, but he no longer feared the passing of time in the same way. He understood that time was not an enemy stealing his life, nor a treasure he could store for later. It was simply something that moved through him, giving him moments and taking them away, asking only that he notice them before they became memories. One quiet afternoon, Elias returned to the river where he had first met the mysterious old man. He sat beneath the same tree and waited until sunset, wondering whether the stranger might appear again. But no one came. There was no silver pocket watch, no mysterious voice, and no impossible journey through time. Only the river flowed quietly, as if reminding him that some lessons do not need to be repeated. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Elias reached into his pocket and found the silver watch he had carried all those years. He opened it one final time. The hands were still frozen, but now he understood why. The watch had never been broken. It had simply stopped measuring something that could never truly be measured, the value of a moment. Elias closed the watch and placed it beside him on the grass. He did not need it any more. He had spent enough of his life asking how much time remained, how far he had come, and what tomorrow might bring. As darkness settled over the river, Elias simply watched the first stars appear and whispered to himself, "For once, I don't need tomorrow to be anything. Today was enough." As Elias grew older, his life became quieter, but it also became fuller in ways he had never expected. He spent mornings walking through the town, afternoons reading beside open windows, and evenings sharing meals with people who had slowly become like family. He still thought about tomorrow, but no longer as something he needed to conquer. Tomorrow had become a possibility, not a destination. One morning, a young employee came to Elias, asking for advice about his future. The young man was ambitious, impatient, and worried that he was falling behind everyone else. Elias listened carefully before smiling and saying, "There is nothing wrong with wanting more from life. Just be careful that you do not spend your entire life preparing for a life you never actually stop to experience." The young man asked Elias how he had learned such a difficult lesson. Elias looked toward the window for a moment, remembering a rainy afternoon beneath an old tree and an impossible journey through time. He knew the story would sound unbelievable, so he simply answered, "I learned it the expensive way." Then he smiled and added, "But perhaps you don't have to." The young man left with a thoughtful expression, and Elias returned to his desk. For the first time, he realized that perhaps the greatest way to honor his mother was not by remembering the past forever, but by living the kind of life she had once hoped he would have. A life where ambition had a place, but never occupied every room. That evening, Elias walked home through streets glowing beneath the setting sun. He noticed an elderly couple sitting together on a bench, a child chasing birds across a small park, and a shopkeeper closing his doors after a long day. None of these scenes had anything to do with him, yet Elias found himself smiling. He had finally discovered that a life did not need to belong to him to be beautiful. When he reached his house, Elias found the silver pocket watch resting on the table where he had left it years before. He picked it up and opened the lid, expecting to see the same frozen hands. But this time, the watch was moving again. The second hand ticked slowly, then the minute hand followed, and Elias watched them with wonder before realizing that he no longer needed to stop time. He carried the watch to the garden and placed it beneath the old wooden bench. He did not know whether the strange old man had ever truly existed or whether the watch had been some dream created by a tired heart. Perhaps it did not matter. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some are simply meant to leave us wiser than they found us. Elias sat on the bench as evening slowly turned into night. He thought about the young man he had once been, the old man he had become, and the many versions of himself that had spent years believing happiness was somewhere else. He no longer felt anger toward them. They had simply been trying to find their way. And perhaps that was what everyone was doing. The night grew darker, and Elias looked toward the stars above his garden. He remembered all the years he had spent worrying about becoming someone, achieving something, and reaching somewhere. Yet the older he became, the simpler his understanding of life became. Perhaps life was not a road leading toward a final destination. Perhaps it was simply a collection of moments we were given before they quietly became memories. Before going inside, Elias looked once more at the silver watch beneath the bench. Its hands continued moving steadily through the night. He smiled and whispered, "Go ahead." Then he turned toward his warm house, where a light was still burning in the window, and for once he did not wonder what tomorrow would bring. He was simply grateful that tonight had arrived. Years passed quietly, and Elias eventually became a very old man. His hair was completely white, his steps were slower, and his hands trembled slightly when he held his morning cup of tea. Yet he had never felt more at peace. He no longer counted his days by what remained undone, but by the small moments that had filled them: a warm meal, a familiar voice, a sunset, or a simple laugh. One morning, Elias received a letter from the young employee he had once advised. The man had left the company years earlier and built a modest life of his own. In the letter, he thanked Elias for one sentence that had stayed with him: "Do not spend your whole life preparing to live." Elias read the words several times and smiled, realizing that perhaps one small lesson could travel farther than any fortune. That afternoon, Elias walked slowly to the old bakery near the neighborhood where he had grown up. The place was still there, though everything around it had changed. He ordered the same warm bread his mother once loved and sat beside the window. As rain began tapping softly against the glass, Elias closed his eyes and remembered her voice, not with sadness this time, but with gratitude. For a moment, Elias imagined his younger self sitting across the table, impatiently looking toward the future and wondering when life would finally become meaningful. The old Elias smiled at that younger version of himself. He wished he could tell him that there was nowhere he needed to reach, no perfect moment waiting ahead, and no future powerful enough to make the present worthless. The rain continued for nearly an hour, and Elias remained exactly where he was. He did not check the time or think about what he should be doing next. He simply watched the droplets slide down the window while the smell of warm bread filled the small bakery. It was an ordinary afternoon, almost identical to thousands he had once ignored, and somehow that made it beautiful. When Elias finally returned home, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills. He prepared a simple dinner and opened the window to let the evening air inside. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing, birds were settling into the trees, and a distant clock announced another hour passing. Elias listened without fear. Time was moving, and for once he was moving with it. After dinner, Elias went into the garden and sat beneath the old tree he had planted many years earlier. Its branches were now wide enough to cover the bench beneath them. He placed his hand against the rough bark and thought about how strange life was. The boy who once wished time would stop had become an old man who finally understood why it had to keep moving. He looked at the stars and thought of his mother, his old friends, the stranger beside the river, and every version of himself that had carried him to this quiet evening. He no longer wished to return to any of them. He was grateful for them, but he belonged here, in this moment, beneath this sky, with nothing to chase and nothing he needed to prove. Then Elias noticed the silver pocket watch resting quietly on the bench beside him. He picked it up and listened to its gentle ticking. The sound no longer reminded him of everything he had lost. Instead, it sounded like a quiet heartbeat, reminding him that every passing second was not an invitation to hurry, but an invitation to be alive while it was still here. Elias closed his eyes and took one slow breath, feeling the cool evening air against his face. He thought about tomorrow, but only for a moment. Tomorrow might be wonderful, ordinary, difficult, or never arrive at all. He finally understood that none of those possibilities could diminish the value of tonight. For the first time in his life, Elias was not chasing tomorrow. He was simply here. The following morning, Elias woke before sunrise and remained in bed for a few quiet minutes, listening to the world slowly return to life. He heard birds beyond the window, distant footsteps on the road, and the soft movement of leaves in the garden. Once, he would have reached for his phone and immediately begun planning the day. Instead, he smiled and thought, "I am already here." He prepared breakfast slowly, without checking the clock, and opened the curtains to let the morning light fill the room. On the table beside his cup of tea lay the silver pocket watch, its hands moving steadily forward. Elias looked at it for a moment and understood something he had once found impossible to accept. Time was not asking him to accomplish anything. It was simply asking him to notice that he was alive. Later that morning, Elias walked through the town and saw the same hurried faces he had once recognized in his younger years. People carried briefcases, checked their watches, hurried across streets, and spoke about meetings they could not miss. Elias did not judge them. He understood them too well. He had once been one of them, believing that life was something waiting at the end of all that rushing. At the corner of a quiet street, Elias noticed a young man sitting alone on a bench, staring anxiously at his phone. The young man looked frustrated, as though the future were already demanding more from him than he could give. Elias considered walking past, but something made him stop. He sat beside the stranger without saying anything, offering only the quiet presence he had once wished someone had offered him. After several minutes, the young man finally looked up and asked Elias why he was sitting there. Elias smiled and said, "Sometimes you don't need someone to solve your problems. Sometimes you only need someone to remind you that you are allowed to breathe before facing them." The young man lowered his phone and took a slow breath. Neither of them said anything more. Elias eventually stood and continued walking, leaving the young man beneath the morning sun. He did not know whether that small conversation would change anything, and he did not need to know. He had learned that not every good thing needed to become a great achievement. Some kindnesses were valuable simply because they happened, quietly, and without anyone keeping score. That evening, Elias returned home and found the silver watch lying on the garden bench. He picked it up, opened it, and saw the hands moving toward midnight. For a brief moment, he wondered whether the old stranger might appear again. But then he smiled. He no longer needed another lesson. The lesson had become part of him, quietly living in the way he looked at every passing day. As midnight approached, Elias sat beneath the old tree and listened to the ticking watch. His breathing became slower, his thoughts became quieter, and the world around him seemed wonderfully still. He thought about all the tomorrows he had chased, all the todays he had ignored, and all the people who had taught him what truly mattered. He felt no regret now, only gratitude. The silver watch suddenly stopped ticking. Elias looked down and saw that the hands had reached midnight exactly. A gentle breeze moved through the branches above him, carrying the scent of rain and distant flowers. Elias smiled because he understood the final message. Time had never been something he could catch, save, or defeat. It had only ever been something he could experience. Elias leaned back against the old tree and closed his eyes beneath the quiet night sky. He did not ask for another chance, another year, or another tomorrow. He had finally stopped bargaining with time. Whatever came next, he would receive it when it arrived. And whatever remained of this night, he would not spend wishing it were something else. He would simply let it be. The night remained quiet around Elias, and for a long time he simply sat beneath the tree, listening to the wind move gently through the leaves. Then he opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon, where the first faint light of morning had begun to appear. He smiled at the sight, not because he had finally reached another tomorrow, but because he had learned to appreciate the moment before it arrived. The sun slowly rose above the distant hills, filling the garden with soft, golden light. Elias watched the world awaken one small detail at a time, the birds returning to the branches, the flowers opening toward the warmth, and the dew shining on the grass. He realized that the future had arrived exactly as it always did, quietly, without asking permission, and immediately becoming the present. Elias reached for the silver pocket watch one final time and held it beneath the morning light. The hands had started moving again, quietly and steadily, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. He smiled and placed the watch inside a small wooden box, beside an old photograph of his mother. Some things, he understood, were not meant to be carried forever. They were meant to remind us how to live. Before leaving the garden, Elias looked at the old tree one last time. He remembered the boy he had been beneath another tree many years ago, dreaming about a future he believed would finally make him happy. Now he understood that happiness had never been waiting at the end of the road. It had been walking beside him all along, quietly asking to be noticed. Elias returned to the house and opened the curtains of every window, allowing the morning sunlight to fill the rooms that had once felt so empty. The house no longer represented the success he had spent his life chasing. It had become something simpler, a place where people could gather, where stories could be told, where meals could be shared, and where an ordinary day could be enough. He sat at the old dining table and looked at the empty chair where his mother had never been able to sit again. The sadness was still there, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like love that had nowhere else to go. Elias smiled softly and whispered, "I finally understand." Outside, the morning continued without waiting for him, and this time he was ready to walk with it. Elias spent the rest of that day doing nothing remarkable. He watered the garden, prepared lunch, read a few pages of an old book, and watched clouds move slowly across the sky. Yet when evening came, he realized that the day had felt fuller than many years of achievement. Nothing had been conquered, nothing had been earned, and nothing had been postponed. He had simply lived it. And perhaps that was the secret Elias had spent his entire life trying to discover. Life was never hiding somewhere beyond the next achievement, the next fortune, or the next morning. It had been present in every conversation, every breath, every quiet meal, every hand held, and every ordinary afternoon he had once hurried past. Tomorrow could offer another day, but it could never return the one we refuse to notice. As the sun disappeared and the first stars appeared above the quiet town, Elias stood beside his window and watched the evening become night. He no longer feared tomorrow because he no longer needed tomorrow to save him. He had finally learned the difference between hoping for the future and living for it. Tomorrow was welcome whenever it came, but tonight already belonged to him. Elias closed the window, turned off the light, and rested quietly in his chair as the world outside fell asleep. He had spent his youth chasing tomorrow, his adulthood building for tomorrow, and his old age finally learning to live today. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of life is not that tomorrow never lasts, but that we keep waiting for it while today quietly passes. And so Elias stopped chasing tomorrow and finally began to live.